March is National Women's History Month. In 1980, the National Women's History Alliance was founded in Santa Rosa, California, by a group of women who discovered that women's history was not being reported in school social studies books. Myra Podkik-Sadker said each time a girl opens a book and reads a womanless history, she learns she is worth less. In 1987, the group led a successful campaign to have Congress declare the entire month of March National Women's History Month. Each year, the National Women's History Alliance chooses a theme in order to honor women across the country, and the United Methodist Church adopts the theme. The 2021 theme is Valiant Women of the Vote. We continue celebrating the 2020 theme of the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote. On Election Day in 1920, millions of American women exercised their right to vote for the first time. For almost 100 years, women and some supportive men had been fighting to win that right. They had made speeches, signed petitions, marched in parades, and argued over and over again that women, like men, deserved all of the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. The United Methodist Church is unique among denominations in having a general commission on the status and role of women. The commission is one of 13 general agencies of the United Methodist Church. Its first mandate is for the chair of the Committee on Status and Role of Women at each church to make sure that every woman in the church knows there is an advocate for her if she experiences sexual abuse or harassment by any male in the church. Its second mandate is to make certain that any woman who wishes to participate, speak out, or speak up in this church is never prevented because she's a woman. I monitor the inclusiveness of women in all areas of our church by counting the committee participations, the leadership positions, and the special project titles occupied by women. The state of inclusiveness at our church is excellent. The Living 2020 honorees for Valiant Women of the Vote, chosen by the National Women's History Alliance, are Maria Teresa Kumar, CEO of Voto Latino, Eleanor Holmes Norton, a civil rights leader, congressperson, lawyer, and organizer, Terry A.O. Minnis, Senior Director of the Census and Voting Programs, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Edith Mayo, suffrage historian and women's history movement activist. These women have gone into politics, opened nonprofits in order to increase voter registration and fight for civil rights, and have publicized women's struggles through their writings and exhibitions. Also honored are women who have passed away. One of the women was Marie Foster, born in rural Wilcox County, Alabama, in 1917. She faced racism daily and became a courageous and unrelenting leader in the civil rights movement during the 1960s. She worked closely with Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders in Alabama to secure the right to vote for African Americans. She died in 2003. Historical women of the United Methodist Church who fought for women's right to vote were Frances Willard, Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, Mary McLeod Bethune, Jessie Daniel Ames, and Dolores Height. Trudy Kibbe Reed, the first woman president of Bethune-Cookman University, retired in 2012. During her career, she made it a priority to get her students to the polls to vote. The 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote should be celebrated, but it is with a sense of irony that we applaud, since men have been voting in the United States for 244 years. Mind-boggling. A musical group called EMF has a song called Unbelievable. After each verse is the tagline, "You're unbelievable." I was tempted to step up to preach this sermon and simply say, "How dare you? You're unbelievable. Amen." But it's highly unlikely that any man here was in Congress from 1776 through 1919. So now we have the right to vote. So what? Are you using it? Men and women both have the right not to vote, but then you can't complain about the results. Winning the right to vote solves all the problems for women, yes? Of course not. There are untold numbers of atrocities exercised against females around the world that need to be addressed in many parts of the world, women are treated as chattel. They have no rights and are often beaten and abused. In America, if you Google inequality issues for women, you will find the following: sexual assault, sexual harassment, sex discrimination in employment, pay gap in employment, underrepresentation as elected officials, underrepresentation as CEOs of companies, in the minority working in the news media, and many, many more. The difference here is indisputable. Most of the issues listed above are debatable. The difference here is that while not having the right to vote was indisputable, the issues listed above are debatable. Women who believe that discrimination exists in a particular situation have to gather their facts. Then what do you do? In 2004, a movie called Iron-Jawed Angels, starring Hilary Swank as suffragette Alice Paul, was released. Alice Paul helped organize the National Women's Party in 1916. President Woodrow Wilson had been dragging his feet in supporting the women. When World War I broke out and Wilson made strong statements about the right of democracy for people in Europe, but remained silent on women's suffrage, Alice Paul and the members of the National Women's Party borrowed the tactics of radical militant women in England. They picketed the White House and engaged in other forms of civil disobedience to publicize the suffrage cause. Criticizing a wartime president so outraged some citizens that men attacked the picketers and physically beat them. The suffragettes were arrested and sent to Occoquan Workhouse, a prison in Virginia. Paul and her compatriots demanded to be treated as political prisoners and staged hunger strikes. Their demands were met with brutality, and women, including frail older women, were beaten and thrown into cold, unsanitary, and rat-infested cells. Arrests continued and conditions at the prison deteriorated. For staging hunger strikes, Alice Paul and several others were forcibly fed by having a feeding tube shoved down their throats. Prison officials removed Paul to a sanitarium in hopes of getting her declared insane. When news of the prison conditions and hunger strikes became known, the press, some politicians, and the public began demanding the women's release. Sympathy for the prisoners resulted in much support for the cause of women's suffrage. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment. 6 days later, Secretary of State Colby certified the ratification, and with the stroke of his pen, American women gained the right to vote after a 72-year battle. August 26th is now celebrated as Women's Equality Day in the United States. Now, if you're the marching, picketing, protest type, I'm sure you can find a group to join for your particular cause. You have to bear in mind, however, that there is always the possibility of violence when you engage in highly visible dispute. The lesson from the 2021 theme, Valiant Women of the Vote, is that you have to speak up and speak out when you see an injustice against women that you wish to change. What can you do on your own? If you're lucky, you'll have a role model. Mine was my mother. She was feisty. My sister and I always said she never met an argument she didn't love. If you engaged her in a disagreement and she started out, "Do you mean to tell me?" you'd better run. As she pursued her opinion, she would say, "I figure." We always said that on her headstone we were going to put, "She figured wrong," but we went with something less scandalous. My mother was one of 10 children. There were 4 girls and 6 boys. My mother was a terror. She argued, talked back, and threw tantrums. My grandmother used to tell her that she couldn't wait until my mother got married and had a child of her own. Well, she got married at 18, and 4 years later she had me, and I was a perfect child. My mother smirked at my grandmother. Then 9.5 years later, she had my sister, who was my mother reincarnated. She argued, talked back, and threw tantrums. There are those who would attest that this behavior continues today, but she's my baby sister, and you'd best not mess with her. Even if you have excellent role models, it usually takes some years for a young woman to become a strong woman, or at least a strong woman who doesn't have trepidations as she takes a stand. During my younger years, I stood up for myself against personal injustice, but it was scary and unpleasant. It's only been about the last 15 years where I've said, bring it. To be a valiant woman for whatever your cause, you don't have to be insufferable as you stand up for your beliefs. While there are a couple of ladies in the congregation with whom you don't want to engage in a knife fight, look at how charming we all are. Don't assume your role models have to be other women. As one of 4 daughters during the 1920s and 30s, my mother and her sisters had to help cook and clean. She always told me that she didn't want me to go through what she'd been subjected to. In point of fact, she was a fanatic about her cooking and cleaning and didn't want to have to monkey around overseeing a 12-year-old. Consequently, later in life, at the big parties at my grandmother's house, all the aunts and aunt-in-laws would be in the kitchen serving up the food and doing the dishes, and I'd be standing at the bar with my uncles. My uncles ranged in age from 25 years older to 5 months older than I. What I learned from them was how to take a punch, so to speak, in the teasing arena. I can give as good as I get. I like to talk sports, and I have adopted some of the traits of men that are evident in the best of them: strength, courage, independence, leadership, and assertiveness. So you must be wondering, when the churchy part of this sermon kicks in, we're not a town hall after all. Let's start with the story of Esther. In Esther 4:14-16, her cousin Mordecai said to her, "And who knows, but you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." God may have created you for a single time, such as whatever you're choosing to stand up against, or he may have several such challenges for you. Many of you know that I have a big red birthmark at the top of my chest. It is the kind that is usually on the face, so I'm all right with it. I taught in Black and Hispanic elementary schools in Chicago. Very few white children ever attended. One year, a 3rd grade boy in my class was whiter than snow with really blonde hair. He had red birthmarks up and down both of his arms. Kids being kids, he had taken a lot of harassment in his short life over the so-called disfigurement. When we started school in September, I would have had on some open-necked shirt, and part of my birthmark would have been visible. Can you imagine his shock when his teacher was like him? I casually said, "My birthmark is on my chest. I know God put me in that class for that little boy." Another way to become a strong woman who feels capable of standing up for what she believes in is to try new things. When I first came to this church, John Klein was the chair of the Evangelism Committee, and Gary Greenwood was the chair of the Education Committee. After a couple of weeks, I saw both of them coming at me one Sunday morning to recruit me to join their committees. With all due respect to our friend Reverend Mark Teasdale, who is an evangelism professor at Garrett Theological Seminary, I believed that evangelism meant knocking on doors like a Jehovah's Witness and beseeching someone to join our church. I might have been good at it because my mother holds the distinction of being the only person in history who had 2 Jehovah's Witnesses tell her that they had to go. But I didn't care to give it a try, so I turned to Gary and said, "I'll be on your committee." Karma was at work in my life because a few years ago when I was on the nominations committee, soliciting people to be committee chairs, I told Victor that Jeff would co-chair the evangelism committee with him if he'd say yes. I told Jeff that Victor would co-chair the evangelism committee with him if he'd say yes. Actually, neither one of them said anything of the kind. I lied to them. I did feel guilty, so I sent Jeff some ideas in an email. He played a good hand and suggested that I join the committee and share the ideas. Score. I'm now on the committee for life, and I have become more secure in what it means. The next new thing that happened last year was that Reverend McCoy drafted me onto the trustees committee. As lay leader, I'm supposed to go to all the committee meetings. Trustees, yawn. I told you in a previous talk that when Reverend Moon informed me of that, I pretended not to understand him. I tried to ignore Reverend McCoy as well, but he simply replied, Tuesday, 11 o'clock. Now I'm the secretary of the committee. We've talked floor tiles, tuck pointing, bathroom remodeling, and leaking roofs, and I'm no longer looking for something to blow my head off with. An incredibly strong woman was on the committee, and she was my role model. Miss Merle was on the committee a long time. She knew everything. She took notes. So I ask, are we all good in the United Methodist Church? Again, the answer is no. As recently as 2007, it was reported that a number of United Methodist congregations still flatly refuse to accept a woman as senior pastor and are especially opposed to receiving a woman in a cross-racial clergy appointment. There are also a number of foreign countries where the acceptance of women pastors is very slow growing. How can you be a valiant woman in the United Methodist Church? The most obvious answer is to pray. The power of prayer is incredible. We have a great number of people sitting in this congregation who can attest to that. Next, never, never be discouraged. As I have told you before, your opinion is every bit as good as anyone else's. It doesn't matter if it's an entertainer, a news person, a politician, a district superintendent of the church, or a bishop in the United Methodist Conference. I write letters or use Twitter to make my opinion known. My philosophy is, suppose a politician says, if 1,000 people contact me, I'll reconsider my stance. Maybe he's received 999 letters and I'm the 1,000th. Does it do any good? Well, I've disagreed with the last 3 United Methodist bishops in the Northern Illinois Conference and written them letters, and I'm still here and they're not. Who's to know? Sometimes speaking up sees results down the road, but you owe it to yourself to stand up. A wonderful song by Rachel Platten called Fight Song expresses my philosophy perfectly. Words from the chorus say, "This is my fight song, take back my life song, prove I'm all right song. I may only have one match, but I can make an explosion." Amen.